So, good morning, and let me welcome you to our workshop. And I'm Mark Schwartz, and this is Lori Galpin, obviously. And we're going to be talking to you today about intimacy and intimacy disorders. So, let me just tell you the background of this workshop. It's going to be a lot of new and fresh stuff. And the idea of it is that obviously a lot of our focus has been on attachment and attachment disorders as a window and understanding intimacy. And we won't go into that much, but just to remind you that these attachment issues occur in the first 5 years of life, and they seem to be able to affect brain development because we're kind of basically born unfinished, and have dramatic effects on our development. And part of disorganized attachment has to do with both the anxious attachment and the avoidant attachment together. But today in particular, we're going to be focusing on avoidant attachment and setting up the early structure in life and then how it affects relationships and intimacy in adulthood. And if I could, just to start us out, in your first slide, what we're showing you is a little bit what we do here in Monterey, which is that Lori and I run a partial hospitalization program called Harmony Place. And in this, we have tracks, and we run 3 groups at a time, one for mental health, one for eating disorders, and one for chemical dependency. And we decided on this primarily because so many people have comorbidity, meaning that they oftentimes present with one but have many. I mean, for example, sexual addiction, which is one of our subspecialties, 80% oftentimes have chemical dependency. So it's necessary to be able to treat both. Or with eating disorders, it's very common that there's bipolar or depression, and it's important to treat both. We want to begin to talk about what happens in the first 5 years of life and how the attachment patterns early in life set up changes in the brain, and then in developmental psychopathology, the development of cognitions, affect, and behavior. And that will eventually result in a person's capacity for intimacy. And what to do about that in therapy. So everything we talk about, we're going to also talk about what you do in therapy in order to be able to facilitate the change process. So in this first slide I've taken from Linda Curdy's chapter, which you'll get a reference for later in the talk, on which is particularly articulate. But what she says is that avoidance refers to the tendency to evade intimacy with other people, but also defend against certain feelings, impulses, memories, and needs that rise internally. Now, what that suggests is that so much of the work in my early career with couples was trying to look at their relationship and to try to work on communication and problem solving and anger management and being able to be aware of what they're thinking and feeling, communicated to others, and so on. And about halfway through my career, I realized that the real issue was the person's intimacy with self, and that it was intrapsychic. And so what we had to do is help a person begin to work inside with certain feelings, memories, and so on. And by becoming intimate with self, then you learn how to be intimate with others. And a lot of our talk today is going to be on intrapsychic intimacy as a prerequisite to interpsychic intimacy. Also to remember that what we know about early attachment patterns is that the way they relate to psychiatric illness is, first of all, what we know is that disorganized attachment in early childhood oftentimes leads to dissociative disorder in adults. And the implication of that is simply that people become fragmented, and they're capable of doing 2 things. So for example, you have a priest who can molest children. And how is it that a person who works on helping people and loving 24/7 is capable of hurting people? but it has to do with internal fragmentation of the self system. And a lot of our work is in trying to facilitate some sort of work internally so that those segmented parts can begin to work collaboratively. But to remember that these early attachment problems don't necessarily cause psychopathology, but instead they set a person up so that they're with certain developmental factors likely to end up with a psychiatric disorder.
Before I read this slide, I just want to say that as a general context, I think that shame, which is much more, in my mind, implicated in psychopathology than it's given credit for being, because of shame, it becomes hard for people to think outside of a context of blame. Like, well, who should we blame for this? Should we blame the parents? Should we blame the person themselves? Should we blame? And really, that's not a very useful construct for understanding. Because when one is focused on blame, it's actually hard to focus on understanding. So these theories that involve historical antecedents to current pathology are not meant to blame anyone, but to describe the human condition, really. So Carl Menninger, who is often also not as acknowledged as a positive source of things that have laid a foundation in a positive way, in a useful way for current psychology, said this in 1942 in a book called Love Against Hate. And I refound it in order to put it in this lecture because I've always thought that it's very potent. Menninger said that the fundamental principle that the capacity for love and hatred is developed in childhood as a result of parental attitudes and behavior is thus of basic importance. So long as people assume that the hatreds of today depend upon events of only yesterday instead of events of many years ago, and I would say sometimes many generations, they are futilely entangled in a psychological fallacy. You know, it's interesting that most of the clients I've ever worked with in the last 36 years would far rather blame themselves for anything that went wrong and for their current struggles than to ever for 1 second think of attributing responsibility to anyone or anything else. And that's interesting. I know that that might be unusual in the world because certainly there are plenty of people in a victim mode. However, that would not be the clients that we see for the most part at all, far removed from that. Furthermore, Carl Menninger asserts, most of the injuries to the child occur while the parent is unconscious of the fact that he is inflicting injury, and they are also repressed into unconsciousness by the child so that he too, in a sense, forgets them. This creates a terra incognita. It's a basic principle of modern psychology that to bring something which has been unconscious into the consciousness of a person, whether it be through education or through psychoanalysis or through relationships of various kinds, I would add, this acts therapeutically by broadening the domain of the ego, or to put it in a more philosophical way, by extending the limits of the region in which it is possible to exercise free will. So to just say that as simply as I can think to say it, there are patterns and there are cycles and there are unresolved contradictions that people tend to reenact in veiled form, sometimes very thinly veiled form. And getting free of it is, at one level, a matter of realizing what you're doing. But the problem is that all this gets laid in, it gets kind of blueprinted at a point that might be actually much before a person's capacity to think about their thinking. And so they're really not operating out of free will. And the more that the unconscious is made conscious, the more there's choice and the more free will begins to become possible, at least a possibility.
Now, I'm going to get a bit emotional here because I think that there's a big old elephant in the living room, which is that our culture is becoming more and more avoidant and enabling. I mean, we're having a webinar rather than being in the same room together. I mean, really? We have therapy online now instead of in the same room with people. We have couples that are both employed outside the home and are taking their phone and computers home with them. We have just, it's ubiquitous, the level of avoidance that's occurring. And every day in my office, I'm completely just flabbergasted by looking at what couples do to each other and don't even realize it. I have a client now who was observed his father commit suicide when he was a child and was incredibly traumatized. And he just told his wife last year, and is now 70 years old. And I just wonder, I say to these people, what's your definition of intimacy? And they think of intimacy meaning sex, but I'm not talking about sex. I'm talking about what people define as necessary for secure attachment. And I would say most people that I work with really have never thought about that or have a frame of reference. And so I think we need to better articulate this almost from a cultural level. And then, this distancing we're talking about has so many elements. I'm not going to read the slides to you, but you can just see just the list of things here. It can be, the false self, which is phoniness. It could be, conflict habituation and defensiveness. It can be, if you're disconnected from your partner, you're probably disconnected from your kids, but your kids don't know that you're disconnected because, you're doing all the instrumental kinds of things. But instrumental intimacy is only one form of intimacy. Emotional intimacy has to do with vulnerability and the ability to be able to sit down with your child and see them when they're in distress and help them begin to articulate in words, because most children don't have words for the level of distress that they have. They need parents to be able to give them the words in order to be able to become emotionally intelligent. So what we're saying then is that avoidance begins with avoidance to self. And what happens is that the person, becomes busy and they move to work, to parent, to running, to go to the gym. They keep busy all the time, so they don't have a moment to think and feel. And, I have a colleague who used to say, if you want to treat an alcoholic effectively, have them go sit under a tree for 30 minutes. And I used to laugh at that, but lately I've been thinking that there's some wisdom to that, because it's ability to be alone and be with oneself that seems to be so difficult, which seems paradoxical with avoidance, because avoidance means that you move distance from people and kind of ride out in the pasture with your Marlboros and on your horse. But in truth, so many of the people we see keep themselves so busy that they don't have to deal with all the things that have happened in their lives. And obviously related to that is their inability to ban emotions, which is that they think they feel. And think about that for a minute. They think they feel. And so they're all cognitive. And when you say to them, how do you feel about that? Which is the favorite therapist phrase, individuals have absolutely no ability to be able to go deep and be able to identify emotions. And of course, that's because in the first 5 years of life, no one put words to their experiences. As the trauma research is showing that children, bad things happen to children, but they're really unable to put it into emotions and feelings. And so on the right-hand side here, that here are some of the patterns of avoidance, which is so many of the clients misread other people. And what that means is that they think everyone dislikes them, or they think that they're radioactive, or they think that somehow the feelings they have about themselves, which is shame bound. I feel defective. I feel ugly. I feel fat. They misperceive that others see them in that way. In other words, their mirrors are really distorted because in the first 5-10 years of life, the mirrors have been really distorted. And so they're unable to perceive themselves accurately. So a lot of the work that has been done on metacognitive kinds of issues, which is the ability to observe oneself accurately, turn out to be relatively important for beginning to develop a relationship with self. Also, people are highly avoidant distractible. They're always on their phone, they're multitasking because they have ADHD. And the result of that is if anybody points out anything to them, they feel defensive, anxious, and unable to observe themselves. And so, what they say in metacognitive therapy is that plain old psychotherapy is so useful because it just teaches the people to take 1 hour a week and sit and be able to focus inside and identify. And therapists begin to help them to get words for their internal experiences. And it's all that basic psychotherapy that has been effective for a long period of time, but we're now understanding more about why that is. Now, what we're going to do today is fine tune that to take basic good old psychotherapy and make it even more sophisticated.
So I like to try to break things down to their basic elements as much as possible. So thinking about what Mark and the slides have described so far, I would throw in that one thing that happens early on, really early on, and continues throughout the bulk of childhood, but the fundamentals of it are in place very early, is that anything, any behavior, any feeling, any pattern that a child perceives doesn't net them attention of the caregiver causes them to attempt to banish whatever it is. And strategies arise without a person even knowing that they're adapting and adopting a strategy, because little kids aren't even thinking about strategy. So whatever becomes punishable, if you have to go to your room until you can come out with a smile on your face, well, you may be forced to capitulate and do that. And so you may banish your feelings of anger because that's talking back, because that just won't be tolerated. But obviously it doesn't go away. It just becomes submerged and turns in various directions, often against the self or substitute others. And then, of course, at adolescence, some of it may rise up and make itself felt in a way that's a surprise often to the person themselves as well as other people in the attachment environment. But children are remarkably accommodating initially, and their behavior is shaped by what is rewarded and what is punishable. And any feelings that are off limits, like unauthorized feelings, it's as though, when you're in kindergarten and you get those primary colors and it's like 4 big Crayolas and you're like, wait, there are more colors in the world. I want the whole box. It's like when some of those basic primary feelings are banished, it creates a void of self-awareness. And even years later, the person will not know themselves by virtue of how many arenas of their own affective life have had to be sacrificed in order to gain some semblance of safety and acceptance or membership. I think that in shame-based systems, one has to often sacrifice individuality for the sake of membership. Whereas in a non-shame-based system, you could have both. You could have membership in a group, in a family, wherever, and you could still maintain your own individuality and uniqueness.
You know, just going back um, to the attachment literature, Mary Main and Weston were observing mothers and their children in the laboratory. And what they just summarize is that avoidance is highly associated with mother's anger, her emotional inexpressiveness, and her rejection of physical contact with the infant. So there it is, those three things. Now, we used to think that PTSD was the most important piece of understanding the development of attachment problems. But with complex trauma, what we've come to understand that it's the 24 hours a day, 7 days a week of living with these three aspects, the mother's anger, her emotional expressiveness, and rejection of physical contact, that actually are at the core of most people's trauma. Now you say, why mothers? And the answer is, I think the literature is becoming richer now in understanding that it's not just mothers, it's caretakers. Lack of empathy, and that turns out to be really critical. And like Lori said earlier, parents are unaware of their lack of attunement. And, one set of parents said to me, I swore my parents were both alcoholics, and we used to have to put out their cigarettes and turn out the lights and lock the doors every night. And we swore that we were never going to do that to our children. But I tell you, as I come in here today, I think we screwed up our children, maybe in a similar kind of way to our parents screwed us up, but we don't really know how or why we did it. And I thought that was so profound in its own simplicity, which is that these parents had absolutely no boundaries whatsoever, and they didn't have what is now called reflective function. The reflective function written about by Fonagy is that what children need more than anything is a parent who sits down with them and helps them understand their relationship with other people, with institutions out there, and to make meaning and sense of the world around them. And it's that on a daily basis that it really involves parenting, but it's not really been well described even in the parenting books. Anyway, the point being that mothers who are very critical and produce children that can be very avoidant. And the mothers think that they're being really great mothers by teaching their children, and you shouldn't do this, you better do that. And it's that negativity. So the child comes in with great enthusiasm, with a big smile, and is returned with something that's negative. And you see that not just in childhood, but throughout life. I just got a promotion. Well, you better watch you don't get fired. And parents think they're being helpful by being critical because they're so worried about the kids, and they don't realize what they're doing is, kind of putting water on the fire. And so, you want to talk about the second part of this?
No, you talk about the second part of it if you don't.
All right. Well, Lyons Ruth in Boston, she's great. And what she talks about is that school-age kids, that what happens with these attachment problems is that they have two styles. One style is that they become very quiet and polite, and they take care of their parents. And their sisters or brothers, on the other hand, become really angry or aggressive in some ways. And so the same early attachment patterns have two different results. And if you think about it, avoidance it's like a heads and a tails. On one hand, you can avoid by being codependent and be caretaking. And what's part of the avoidance there is that you don't even exist. You exist only in relation to other, and you're always, don't be mad at me, don't be upset with me. And they're oriented towards pleasing others. And that's one way of avoidance. And the other way of avoidance is a more aggressive style, being defensive and angry and leave me alone, all that kind of jazz. So the same trauma can result in either style. And as you look at them over the developmental period, it's really interesting to see what happens to them in their adult relationships. And of course, the point I made earlier is that children, according to Lyons Truth, rarely have the ability to put words to what's happening to them in their families. And so, but they're left to enact these in their body. So many of the new somatic therapies are understanding that what Bessel van der Kolk would be emphasizing, which is that trauma is just in the body. And so because you can't put it into words, it has to do with your gestures and so on. So, it's like I watch people as they interact here, and they're looking at the floor, they have no eye contact, they're incredibly anxious. And so much of their communication is stay away from me, don't ask me any questions, leave me alone. And they don't even know that that's what they're communicating.
Well, so to pick up on what I was saying a minute ago, the child essentially sends away, exiles, disowns, puts in a deep freeze aspects of themselves that don't net them the kind of attention or approval they're desperately seeking. And as Mark says, then there can be protective parts that come in and devise a strategy, which later in life you see as, for example, people that are compulsively caretaking of others. It's like a preemptive strike. Let me give so much to you. Look, I baked a casserole and everything. And let me lend you some money. Let me drive you to the doctor. Let me do for you. And then you'll tolerate me at the very least. And maybe you'll even think I'm a decent person. And maybe I can think I'm a decent person. But the real self, if you like, and/or parts of the self are just exiled. So it never feels like enough. You never feel like people appreciate you enough or you're doing enough, because it's based on continuing to keep a part of self exiled that doesn't feel worthy and covering it over with this strategy for redemption or acceptance. Alternatively, when that doesn't work after a while, the person's like, well, fuck it, then I won't need it. And that's how I'll cope with it. I just won't need it. I won't need it. And there's versions of I don't need it. One version of I don't need it is acting out and breaking things and being angry. But another version of I don't need it is being like the perfect student, the perfect child. She never gave us any trouble. We can't believe she has an eating disorder now. But, anorexia is about not needing anything, not even food. So a person becomes disconnected from aspects of self, and they also disconnect information that's inconsistent with their idealization sometimes of the attachment relationship or the attachment figure. This says information inconsistent with the attachment figure is disconnected from awareness. So the child keeps favorable views of the parents while any knowledge of their bad or disappointing aspects is excluded. And so all injury is seen as being in response to badness in the child. And the quote is, I know my mother loved me. She just didn't know how to show it. It was hard for her because I was just always in trouble. So people take effect and make it into cause. Oh, well, my mother, it was hard for her to love me because I was always in trouble. Maybe you're always in trouble because it was hard for her to love you. And again, I'm not faulting the mother, because usually, the mother herself was missing key elements of what was needed, but she had to idealize her own situation and blame herself. So now perhaps she's hard on herself and hard on the child as an extension of herself without even knowing it, with just thinking that's how you parent. So what a person hasn't had, a person often doesn't know they're lacking, and it's not their fault that they don't know that. And what a person hasn't had, sometimes they try desperately, mightily to grant to their own children. I know lots of people that were in hellish situations growing up at every level, at every level. And they tried like crazy to make sure that none of that ever came through them to their child. And yet the problem becomes, and it's difficult, that how a person treats themselves, gets noticed by children. So if you're a perfectionist with yourself and you tolerate no flaws, but you're even kind and compassionate with other people, if you're the child's favorite person, they're going to see how you treat yourself at the same time as they see how you treat others. And they're going to take after you in ways that you had no intention of having happen.
One of the things that changed the way Lori and I think is that we were trained in the adult attachment interview by Jakovitz of Mary Main's clinic. And one of the most important aspects of learning to score the adult attachment interview was realization that the number one block to secure attachment is loyalty to the family. So as I'm doing this, I want to try to lay out a cookbook of how you do treatment. But one of the steps in treatment is to begin to have the person basically confront themselves about looking at their past through rose-colored glasses and beginning to have a narrative which includes some ability to have cohesiveness. In other words, if they have various symptoms, there is a cause for those symptoms, a developmental psychopathological cause. And so what we're looking for them is to begin to write a map of the things that have happened in their lives that might somehow relate to the current symptom. And for example, yesterday I was working with a woman who was a sexually compulsive, and she had been molested and raped. And she assumed that her sexual compulsion was around those events. And she said, it doesn't have to relate to anything in my childhood, does it? Does this happen later in her life? And as we looked at it, there was lots and lots of stuff that happened with her mom and bringing different men in the house and a lot of neglect and abandonment. And so somehow she didn't understand how a lot of the early childhood stuff related to her adult sexual compulsivity. And sort of the way I think about that is that these early attachment problems don't necessarily manifest themselves into adult psychopathology until something happens in adulthood, which is a trigger. And so something like, going to Iraq or rape or some horrible event like that will oftentimes take all the early attachment difficulties and then manifest itself. It may not seem obvious, even in the military, there's sometimes a difficult time understanding why these adult symptoms are not related to Iraq per se, but the early childhood stuff that somehow predisposes that. And, the key element is to understand that these early attachment problems are necessary and contribute to why many people don't get better by doing just simply trauma-based therapy. The sexuality component is particularly mysterious. Lori and I have been sex therapists, for most of our careers. And I swear to you, even working with Masters and Johnson for many years, that there's so much about sexuality that we didn't understand until we really began to understand disorganized attachment and avoidance in particular. And there was some literature that came out among adolescents who've had disorganized attachment. And one of the primary symptoms was when they had sex in their teens, what they said was, I don't know what people get out of this. When someone touches me, I don't feel anything. I feel numb. Now that just blew my mind, because the idea is that when you aren't picked up and held or loved as a child, oftentimes the touch, which is so important for intimacy, doesn't have the same effect of allowing you to feel connected to another human being. And so So many of the individuals who come in who have addictions will say, what are you afraid will happen if you give up your addiction? And the person says, I'll be alone. And if you think about that, I'll be alone, it seems like it has many levels. Alone is, by myself, but alone is I have a total inability to connect and feel connected to other people. And touch is sort of an example of that. So much of what the work with sexual addiction is that people are fucking. They're doing impersonal sex. They're spending hours on looking at pornography, but they're starving for intimacy. And so what gets written into their brain is if you want to feel unalone, you need to have an orgasm or you need to be sexual. And they get wired together. And so sex somehow means intimacy. And what you have to do is disconnect those things. And so sex is part of intimacy, but so much of intimacy is being able to be close to someone, to hug, to enjoy touching, to be able to kiss, to look into someone's eyes. And when you do that, feel that sense inside that you're not alone. And boy, working with the intimacy problems is much, much bigger issue. So having people go to 12-step meetings, have people doing relapse prevention, having people practice abstinence, all that stuff is certainly the first stage of treatment. But if you really want to work with sexual addiction, you have to understand it as avoidant attachment. And repairing avoidant attachment is far more complicated than what I just said. And so part of what this lecture is trying to say, how do you treat avoidant attachment? And I think we have a formula for that seems to be working, which we'll be trying to tell you by the end of the talk. This just suggests that if you think of pornography, I mean, it begins at age 11. People are, during COVID, the kids would be in their room with their electronics and, they would be spending a large amount of times just on the computer screen and hardwiring all that into their brain. So we have a whole new world of young people. And part of that is the use of pornography. And so, now we have remote working and all that digital stuff becomes an insulation. And, the kids today scare me. I mean, we have our own set of avoidance problems, but I think it's a brave new world of what we're creating out there.
Again, if I boil it down to the way in which I think about the impact of what Mark's describing there, the part one is shame, that there are parts of ourselves that we disown because they don't meet with a positive response. They don't net us acceptance or affection that we can use. It's not usable. And so we construct ourselves. So then the second term that I think is important is objectification. When you exile parts of yourself that you think are unacceptable, substandard, which are actually just perfectly human aspects, and you attempt to become more machine-like, more in control, more never surprised again, more not rejected, then often you create a substitute self, a false self, if you will, or you put forth an object. It could be a good object or a bad object, but it could still net you some attention. So you try to be the perfect something. And again, even if you're the perfect something, it never feels like enough because you feel as though, well, yeah, but that's my smoke and mirrors. That's what I put forth. If people really knew, they wouldn't react to me this way. Or you just have a sense of a void and don't know what's actually missing. And part of what's missing is lots of pieces of oneself. And then, you can put forth an object. Oh, here's an attractive object. Here's the way I look that will net me somebody else's desire temporarily. And then you have a sexual addiction that's based primarily on desire, um, the desire of the other person for you and the validation, however fleeting, that provides. But again, then it's interesting that sometimes people are hypersexual. And then when they get in an actual relationship in which they actually have some safety and connection and even passion, sometimes all the fear just floods back in. And instead of hypersexuality, there's a hyposexual phase. And it's like, what happened here? And the person themselves often really has no idea. But being an object is a good way to bypass true connection. And some people can do it for a lifetime.
Now, the model of disorganized attachment, which we'll be talking about, is that when you get close to someone, you're going to get hurt. And it happens over and over and over again. And so what happens is that it's like if every time you were hungry and ate something, someone shocked the hell out of you, it makes you crazy. And the process is an unconscious one. So what happens is that in the brain, the attachment system is a little bit like the shields on the Star Trek Enterprise. When the Klingons are coming, your shields go up. When the Klingons leave, your shields go down. And so your attachment system is there danger? Shields up. If there's safety, shields down. Now, what would happen if you get nude with another individual who you really care about and your shields go up, but your sexual system goes on? And that is what we're seeing very, very commonly. And whether it be, women who say, I don't really enjoy sex with my husband, or whether it be someone looking at pornography, it's all the same thing, which shields up, sexual system on. Now, the way I do marital therapy now has radically changed. I used to be a cognitive behavioral therapist, and all that stuff was necessary, but never sufficient. And of all the people who I think have influenced me, I think it's Wiley who is the most credible marital therapist. If you get a chance to see some of his YouTube videos, they're breathtaking. And I now pretend like I'm Wiley a lot of the time. And so what I'm trying to do is when one person communicates, I'm so tired that he doesn't put the toilet seat down, instead of just trying to teach him cognitive behavioral skills, I'm trying to listen and really listen to what's happening inside, and the person saying, I don't feel like this person cares about me. I don't feel like my needs are important to them. I feel like there's distance, and so on. And so I'm trying to put words to the statement, and I try to communicate not just the words, but the depths of the feelings that go into that in some way to the partner. And then when the partner responds by saying, I put the toilet seat down, sometimes, that defensiveness is then what I'm trying to communicate to you is that it's not about the goddamn toilet seat. It's about 100 other things in the relationship where I don't feel we're attuned, and that I hope that you know that you want to put the toilet seat down without my telling you to put the toilet seat down. You get it. So I'm tracking the couple, and what's wrong is the attunement. And it's the misattunement in those first 5 years of life that, bring them like this. And that's what disorganized attachment is. It's misattunement. And what relational therapy is helping them become more regulated, and so that they can turn to the relationship as a safe haven and feel listened to, cared for on a consistent, reliable basis. And that each time I bring something that I'm excited about and share it with you, you don't try to fix it, give me advice, or should me, but instead to be able to positively respond with enthusiasm, and not necessarily anything other than caring, and being able to do that. So at the end of the day, you have to download so many of the stresses in your life to the people you care about and have them listen to you. And there's something that's really wonderful about that, except if you have disorganized attachment. The same thing with touch. When you share that in a deep way, you don't feel connected to other people because your shields are up. And so the question is how to be able to work with the disorganized attachment so that when you can be intimate, share your depth of be vulnerable, that it actually is a positive experience rather than a negative one. Because so many of the clients who learn how to be able to do that find that it's actually a negative experience rather than a positive one.
To have that, you'd have to have two people that are both present, number one, and that'd be difficult. And then you'd have to have two people that didn't intentionally hurt each other. You know, just this past week, I realized that a fair number of people are still in relationships where there's some rule that says it's okay to use your partner's vulnerability, the things they've shared with you in moments of intimacy, against them if you get pissed off enough.
Yeah.
And it's like, really? Because I don't know how a person then would ever share anything again. So I just think there have to be some basic ground rules of respect. And obviously, at large right now, there's quite a bit of disrespect. It says all's fair in anything, all's fair in politics, all's fair in war, all's fair in love. And it's like, no, I don't think so. I don't think all is fair, and I don't think that everything is the same as everything else. And I don't think a relationship can be safe if someone's going to take what you give them at a sacred moment and throw it in your face later.
Right. So I've already talked about disorganized attachment, but basically getting close is a source of fear, and there's emotional dysregulation that goes with it. And so what we're doing is we're spending a lot of time in our groups talking about what to do about disorganized attachment, which we'll be sharing with you. If you want more on that, we have other webinars on disorganized attachment, which really delineate that. So I'm not going to repeat that in this one. But the idea is that so many of the clients, particularly the addicts, come in, they say, I don't know who I am. I don't have a relationship with myself. I don't know what my life is about. I have no clear set of values that I live by. And that I feel like sometimes I'm on automatic pilot, just being what other people have expected me to be. And so they have what are called disorders of self. And so in order to be able to understand that, I've gone back to basically the self-psychology literature, Winnicott, Ohut, and others. And, that's where so much of this stuff has been delineated. There's probably nothing new under the sun. So much of it is a reinvention. But our model has mostly to do with borrowing from Dick Schwartz. We were lucky enough to have him in residence with us for a year, and Lori and I did co-therapy with him for that period of time. And, he's a master. And in that internal family systems work, we were able to find some tools which were very gestalty and allowed a person to begin to open up the doors to this world inside that are more what we call parts oriented. And I think parts therapy is now becoming sort of in, and a lot of people are working on it. But we have for years, and of course, just old Gestalt therapy. And in effect, what we're finding is that this fragmentation of the personality or dissociative theory is not just psychological, but probably within brain systems. And so more and more of the kinds of delineation of what happens with disorganized attachment in the brain is that the brain actually becomes fragmented, and the person doesn't have access to certain parts of self, and certain parts of self hijack the self. And so, a client will come in and begin to act like a child. And so, Bruce Perry has this incredible theory about saying that what happens is under stress, many people regress and they become childlike, and they become more like a 16-year-old and more like a 10-year-old. And your ability to be able to attune yourself to that and move from being an adult therapist to a child therapist, or move from adult therapist to being an adolescent therapist, and knowing how to be able to work with those subsystems are so important, because if you misattune yourself to it, then you don't really know how to do that. So, one person said that all therapists should become child therapists before they become adult therapists, because so much of what we're dealing with in trauma is that the person is regressing to that part of self that's injured, and being able to attune yourself to that and begin to facilitate self-healing. And so the Dick Schwartz model, what's most innovative about it is that the therapist becomes catalyst to an internal process of self-healing. So I think the most important innovation in my career has been the study of structural dissociation. Again, Lori and I, we ran a dissociative disorders unit for 15 years, and people referred dissociative clients from all over the country to us. And we learned so much in that laboratory, so to speak, about internal fragmentation of the self system. We were treating a lot of dissociative identity disorder at that time. And we learned so much from treating dissociative identity disorder to working with the fragmentation of people who do not present with a primary dissociative disorder. And it's the lack of cohesiveness. People are ahistorical. If I have a symptom, it never occurs to them that there is a development of that symptom. And so I became particularly wedded to developmental psychopathology and Dante Cucchetti's work. And I've tried to follow that every month in the journal, because that field is just on fire. And we're beginning to look at understanding how these early childhood events changes the brain, and then how developmentally it's like a domino effect where everything in your life affects you in certain ways, and everything affects the next thing and affects the next thing. And so when you say what causes anorexia or what causes sexual addiction, it's a stupid question, because everything in your life does that. And what I've learned after 50 years is that if you want to treat a sexual addict, everything in that person's life has to change. If you want to treat anorexia, everything in that person's life has to change, because what a person does is that once they have a symptom, their whole life becomes sort of adapted around that symptom. And as they let go of that symptom, everything in life has to be able to change. And of all those things that have to change, the most important thing is learning how to use other people as a resource, and so they're not alone. And so I decided that almost all adult psychopathology and addiction is primarily an intimacy disorder and an attachment disorder. So when we ran our eating disorder clinic, the first thing I did is the first 100 clients, I gave them the adult attachment interview and I scored it. 95% of the clients had disorganized attachment. And it didn't surprise me at all. And my hypothesis was that we needed to treat the disorganized attachment, not the eating disorder primarily, and moved my focus instead to working with food, to beginning to look at how to be able to be intimate with other human beings. And I think that's where it's at. And now I've moved that over to working with sexual addiction, obviously, because eating disorder, sexual addiction have a lot of overlap to it. And the primary overlap is learning how to connect to other human beings and not be so alone.
I'm going to try to tell a couple stories. That be okay?
Mhm.
Okay. So just thinking about this exiling, and as Mark calls it, dissociative, which it is, process that occurs, and how it perpetuates itself, and how, as Menninger says, it puts a lot of things out of conscious choice that one would hope to have more free will with regard to. And as I've mentioned, this exiling of parts of self that don't net a person a sense of membership and a sense of whatever degree of safety is possible or acceptance is possible. So one thing that I think of is a story about particular anorexic client, she's very, very smart, and she was just hell bent on wasting away. And she had been since she was in early adolescence. And many people had tried to treat her, and she would sometimes gain weight and then lose it all, as happens often. Um, or she would gain weight and then want to lose it all because she had gained it the wrong way. And so this smart person who deserved to have a life was really sidelined for years. And then, of course, felt more and more behind because of not being able to do the normative things that other people her age had presumably accomplished by then. So she would compare herself then and feel even worse. And of course, when a person restricts food, they become even more obsessional than they used to be. And typically, there's such a high overlap between OCD and eating disorders, especially restricting anorexics, that, you know, and starvation, malnourishment creates in even healthy people within a small space of time obsessionality. So hers was just off the scale. And then trying to get medication on board that would work well enough when she was at such a low body weight. And then, of course, the fears of gaining weight from any medication and the heightened sensitivity to anything that might be a side effect so that it had to be stopped. It was very complicated. So we met this client, and I'm sure she had had at least about a decade of treatment. And I just remember there was a point at which I was trying to work with her a bit to understand what is the block here. And I just really couldn't totally figure it out. I mean, obviously there's a whole constellation of things that needed to be dealt with, but even when that seemed to be the case and there was weight gain, and then there was always the consequent dismantling. So, I just remember that in grad school, they told us some things you just remember, like steer in direction of skid, from when you're 16 learning driving. It's really helpful sometimes. I remember in grad school, they said, when you really aren't sure what is going on, you might want to add another person to the therapy, not a random person. Obviously, you don't just go out on the street, but like another family member, or bringing the whole family. You might just want to add in and see what you can discern about how that changes the dynamic and what comes to light different than what you already had. So I just remember I really started to focus on, well, what was the life of her mother and stepfather, who was the person she grew up with? What was that like? And the most striking thing, other than the stepfather's really intense obsessionality, there's a right way and a wrong way to do things, which, of course, reinforced a lot of messages. And he was a good person, but that was one of his burdens. Her mother had had a horrific tragedy, which involved the mother's father killing the mother's mother when she was a young child, because something got so aggravating that he said, if you do that again, and then out came a shotgun, and it was an innocuous thing, one would imagine, but that's what it resulted in. And then this client's mother was sent to live with a relative, I believe an aunt, who didn't care for her very much. So from an environment in which murder, suicide could happen for this mother of the client, to then an uncaring environment where a relative didn't have any love for her. And this mother, I think, genuinely came out of it probably about as healthy as a person could be without the appropriate therapy and the appropriate interventions. I mean, she did what she had to do and managed to have 2 children herself. But what became really obvious is that she shut down a long time ago. And for example, she did not connect what happened to her in childhood as related to any other thing that happened thereafter. It's like it was in a box all by itself. But the client started to talk about how, well, my mother, when the cat died, when I had a terrible day at school, when people were interacting with me in these ways and I didn't know how to handle it. I mean, I didn't really go to my mother because didn't want to burden her. And she would just, give me basically a platitude about what you had to do under circumstances like that. So what I realized is that there was this whole numbing response that the mother had to adapt just to get through her own PTSD level trauma. But these adaptations outlast the circumstances that gave rise to them. And so the mother, even perfectly well-intentioned, didn't know that she wasn't bringing to the table any empathic resonance because she had none for herself. She was just surviving. And so the daughter learned to just survive and to banish the same parts of self that are what made her human. And therefore, she wanted not to need anything because she wasn't going to be able to derive anything. And she didn't want anyone to feel bad about that. So her solution long before was she should need less. And that was her life, needing less and less and less and less, and feeling tremendous guilt whenever she needed anything beyond what the environment could give her, which then makes a person so impaired that eventually they have to be entirely dependent on the environment to give them everything, like through a feeding tube. So I think that's kind of a stunning example of the intergenerational nature of things and how one's relationship with oneself defines what one causes others around them to also have to exile comparably in response.
It's a beautiful example of everything we've been saying. It actually says it really articulately. The question always is what does this insight, how do you use it in therapy? And, I'm always interested in what makes therapy work. And Dan Siegel has these little quibs, and he says, if you can name it, you can tame it. And I always thought that was cute. But actually, if you think about those words for a long time, you realize that part of psychotherapy is beginning to give words to the experiences and being able to use those words in order to get deep insight into how that might have shaped what's happened in your life. And insight doesn't necessarily cure a person, but certainly having the awareness that Lori just pointed out is the beginning of breaking down denial and minimization and understanding without blame and shame, which is, of course, key to therapy. So the result of all this that we're talking about and Lori just illustrated is self-hate and shame. And, it's ubiquitous. And so, acceptance and commitment therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, those are all really useful tools. We use them every day to help a person unblend from these parts of self that are so punitive, and that we see them as protective, meaning that they came into being to help the person survive, but they're kind of dinosaurs, and now they're causing more problems than they're helping typically. And so beginning not only to be able to do that work, which is I call necessary but not sufficient, that the real important thing is beginning to be able to monitor the ways self-hatred manifests itself, the punitive interject that you have inside, and beginning to have a relationship with that part of self and understanding its function and purpose, and begin to give it a new job.
Well, let's say a little more about parts that get called the punitive introject. I mean, it's an apt description, but I would say, to give them their due, if you can't please people on the outside, and if you get a fair amount of criticism, or you see people that you care about who are not criticizing you, but they're criticizing everyone else, or they're not criticizing everyone else even, but they are highly critical of themselves. Well, then you may develop an internal critic that will, it's like your preliminary alert system, and its job as it sees it, I think, is to point out everything that's wrong or problematic about you in order that you can fix it so that you can be worthy and deserve love. Of course, again, it's never enough. And it makes a person very depressed to have a voice like that inside themselves. And it often makes you very harsh towards yourself. And then that overflows onto others, even if you try to act like you're all charitable and everything. So, because you're always sizing everyone up, because you have to see where you are in the room. And, it's hellish because competition sort of blots out the opportunity for intimacy at a certain point when it's not just friendly competition. So this internal critic doesn't have to do that. It just gets stuck doing it. And unfortunately, it often does a really good job of it. Not that it rectifies anything, because it really doesn't, because it's based on a fallacy. It's based on the idea that there's something horribly wrong with you and that it must be corrected. And that if only it could be totally corrected soon enough, then you would get the love you deserve. But not getting the love you deserve or want is typically not a function of what's going on with you in a perfectionistic way. And if it is, then you're an object. And that's not going to feel much good to be loved as an object anyway. I mean, it's better than nothing, I suppose, but not so ultimately satisfying. So these parts, though, can't do anything. And I think this would be a thing that Dick Schwartz and internal family systems therapy would embrace. These protective parts that are like Marine sergeants, this one anyway, can't really step down until the part that they protect is healed. And often that's a very vulnerable, exiled part that nobody in their right mind wants to reconnect with. And most everybody's afraid to go there, because who the hell in their right mind wants to feel the worst things that they put away in the deepest hole, in the deepest closet, in deepest Antarctica, so that they would never have to feel it again. But, another little rhyming thing, you got to feel it to heal it, but not all at once, because that's exactly what happened the first time. And that's why you haven't wanted to do that again for the last 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years. So incrementally, and without losing access to one's ability to think through the message, but in a way that allows you to feel what it was at the same time like. Because the problem with most adults is that they forget what it's like to be a child, and they forget what it's like to be an adolescent. And, it's not that parents aren't perfect that's the issue. I hope to God no parents are perfect. That would be so tedious, and then they'd have to live in Stepford. That's not the issue. The issue is accepting one's humanity in imperfection. And as a society, we're not real good yet at not being punitive, because we think the alternative to not being punitive is to be a bleeding heart, whatever, fill in the blank. Those are not the only two options. Those are the two ends of the continuum that the pendulum keeps swinging between, and one end of the extreme of it feeds the other end of the extreme of it, and that is not where it's at. But a middle ground between those two is also not where it's at. It's somewhere different. That could be another webinar. Okay. Am I allowed to read this one? No.
Just tell what it says.
I'm going to tell you what this says, essentially. This is from Eric Fromm, For the Love of Life. This was written in 86. So we got 42, we got 86. People are going to think I haven't read a book in a long time. But actually, sometimes things are said so well that you just, can't find anything that says it any better. So this is about sadism. And the basic bottom line of it is that sadism is not necessarily just about wanting to inflict pain and see another person suffer. It's about wanting to have total control over another living creature, another living being. And that wanting to have total control, even if it's quote unquote like benign, even if it's for the other's own good, it still diminishes the person in a way that is damaging. And that I think the idea that Fromm was getting at is that it's the seed of what causes the potential for totalitarian regimes to grow and even be tolerated and even be welcomed. And, some people's households are like a totalitarian regime, but they haven't seen it as such. And so they treat themselves often in the same ways that they were treated. And so, as the slide prior talked about, a person internalizes somewhat of a sadomasochistic relationship with the self. So there's both this this suffering, some of it not really requisite. There's a idea that something out there requires relinquishment of things in order to be good. And that if one doesn't live up to a certain standard somehow, then one deserves to be punished for it. And I think this is an important concept in both restoring the self and in restoring probably society, is to understand the prevalence of that kind of sadism, the kind that wants control.
So just to translate that into what we do in therapy, what I've said is that the first step I do with almost all couples is I remind them that a lot of times they equate, if you love me, you'll do things my way, or you'll feel, think, and act like I feel, think. And so there's a right way to load the dishwasher. And if you love me, you'll load the dishwasher that way. And that error in thinking, destroys committed relationships. Because if you want to be married to someone who loads the dishwasher your way, then why don't you just get married to yourself? Because the reason you're with another person is they're going to think and feel different than you, and they're going to do things different than you. And so the real power of a relationship is what Dr. Masters used to say, you give to get, you give to get. And every time you're willing to be open and be able to give to your partner, you're going to get back more. So, it's like you cook this meal and you're able to say, I'll do the dishes, you cook the meal. And the other person says, no, let me do the dishes. You've worked so hard today. And I say, no, let me do the dishes. You've already cooked the meal. If you're going to fight about something, fight about who can be kinder to one another. Don't fight about, it's your turn, no, it's their turn, that kind of thing. So it's learning how to be able to give, but not in a codependent way, but from your heart, because you really care about the other human being.
Well, to do that, you'd have to not be projecting prior relationships onto them, and that's a tough one. But, there's also, obviously the dishwasher is not just about the dishwasher. And obviously the toilet seat's not just about the toilet seat, and the cap on the toothpaste and whether it's on or not, it's not just about the cap on the toothpaste. But sometimes, like, for example, a person's like, God, could you please just put the toilet seat down, because I go in the middle of the night, the toilet seat's up, it's dark in there, and I just fall through into the water, and it's so unpleasant. Please, just, if at least just put the toilet seat down before you go to bed. The person's like shaping their requirements to be what they think are manageable. And then, of course, the husband insists on putting not just the toilet seat down, but the top down. So then the woman goes in the middle of the night and sits on the toilet and starts peeing on the top of the toilet, which is really unpleasant. And the man just can't correct to just get the seat down, but not the top down. What's going on there? I would say that, sometimes things are passive aggressive. And I was talking in a group yesterday about, sorry to diverge, but not so much. I was talking about my experience in elementary school. And I don't know whether I was just in a school where we had, a significant number of female teachers who didn't seem all that happy. Some of them were wonderful, but some of them not so much, not happy. And some of them would take out their frustrations on the boys particularly. I just remember noticing this. And it's like, I remember this one boy was so funny and so clever. I mean, I really thought, oh my God, he thinks about things and just says funny things that are well thought out. He's not always saying funny things, but when he does, every time he would do it, boy, for the 6 years I was in school with him, I saw just it be crushed, crushed and crushed and crushed all over again. And I thought, it will be a wonder if he can tolerate hearing anything from a woman by the time he gets through with this, or worse yet, he'll get used to it and it'll just crush his spirit. And so I think that often people are fighting with someone who's no longer present, and or they're trying to prove something to someone who is no longer present. And they're doing it through projective identification onto the partner. And then if all's working as it usually does, both partners will have projected things onto one another without knowing it at all, and be trying to elicit or correct or extract or remedy the thing that has not been reconciled previously. But you can't reconcile the past by recreating it unconsciously, because you just fall into the exact same traps all over again, which is so frustrating for just all of us regular human beings, I think.
So, taking what Lori's saying, the question would be, well, what do you do about that in therapy? And the answer to that is that I think the big step for me anyway is that I take the symptom that the person's presenting, in this case being a power struggle, and Lori's saying is that the passive aggressiveness is not about the person in front of you, but oftentimes in reaction to things that have happened in the past. And the idea is that it's unconscious. And so the power of good psychotherapy is bringing what's unconscious into consciousness. And so the question is, how does one do that? And so the idea is that something that person presents as the symptom is where I start the session. So they might present the toilet seat. And what I'm going to be doing is looking at the passive aggressiveness as the symptom I want to attack. And I want to begin to bring that into the 50-minute hour and be able to follow it back to understand what in the past relates to the present. And that's what we call breaking the trauma bond. And the trauma bond is that each one of these symptoms have its origin. So whether a person comes in and says, I looked at pornography 2 hours this week, or a person says I restricted food and didn't eat my meal plan this week, or a person says I'm really angry at you, the therapist, or whether a person says I've been really passive aggressive with my partner. Each of these presentations are what I've reframed as a gift. And if I take the symptom and I just begin to follow the symptom back and use what was called an affect bridge or a somatic bridge, what I'm trying to be able to do is kind of like following the wave, as if you were going out and beginning to surf, and you're going to follow the wave, and it will take you right back to the events that have occurred developmentally that somehow relate to, because for every effect there's a cause. It's unconscious, the person doesn't know it, but if you can begin to bring that into consciousness, you can break the trauma bond. You usually do that with the partner in the room, so that's how I do couples therapy.
And it's really helpful, because then the partner is often like, oh my God, it's not about me. Okay. And then they can have much more empathy and compassion when they know it's actually not about them, assuming they're healthy enough to recognize that. I mean, one thing you don't do in couples therapy, if you can recognize it, is take a couple where one person is determined to move against the other and encourage vulnerability. So if that's what's going on, it's different. But if both people do have some intention for change and not to hurt one another intentionally, there's so much that can happen.
And if I have someone who's moving against, I'm going to see them individually and be able to work with, the origins of that individually.
Sometimes I like to give homework assignments, not because people ever enjoyed homework originally and shouldn't have been out playing, but because sometimes if you have limited time in therapy, a simple assignment that a person does briefly can just kind of extend or deepen something that's safe enough to do on their own, and then it feeds back into the therapy and gets the process moving along at a reasonable clip. Not that efficiency's the goal, but I think sometimes people feel more hopeful when they begin to feel things shifting, which not always in a relieving way, but ultimately in a relieving way. So sometimes when a person's stuck in a pattern, I just find, well, don't try to change the pattern, just have them write about it and why they're hell bent on it. I think that writing can be really useful. I'm not that big on journaling. Some people find it really useful. Some people just get lost in it and it just becomes obfuscating rather than clarifying. So it just depends on how. I like to give brief assignments for periods of time, and I like people to do things at the beginning where they have an intention, they're going to get something usable out of the next 15 minutes perhaps, and inquire and just see what comes, and then after that they're going to do something that changes the channel, that they can just enjoy, something simple like taking a walk with their dog or talking to a friend over coffee. And if they're not willing to do something to change the channel afterwards, I say, well, then don't do this, because I don't want you to think about it all night. I just want you to work with it for 15 or 20 minutes, period. More is not better. So I remember one time, there was, I guess, a client who was incredibly self-sacrificing, and I thought, well, let's just say exactly what the client's doing. So just write to your mom and tell her why you intend to continue to idealize her and blame yourself for all that happened growing up, even if it costs you your own health and your current family and perhaps your life, because that is actually how high all the stakes were, and that is how absolutely intense the polarization was in her, to have her mother on an absolute pedestal and find herself absolutely the one to blame for everything that had ever gone wrong in childhood, when pretty clearly that was costing a lot. I liked this from a long ago lecture, obviously in 1991, but I thought it was very important. Obviously it's the intergenerational transmission of this insecure attachment. So the infant learns to view those affective experiences, and of course affective is like emotional basically, but bigger, affective experiences to which the mother misattunes as falling outside the realm of shareable experience, and to deny or disavow such feelings. It's like what can't be known and accurately registered and mirrored by the attachment figure, the person learns to just omit without even knowing they're learning that. So the relative comfort or discomfort of the mother, if she's the key attachment figure, which often that's who it is, so the relative comfort or discomfort of the mother with certain kinds of emotional states can influence the infant's subsequent access to those same emotions at a very early age, and then from then on. So it's interesting. It's like whatever languages you learn early, you don't learn to make the sounds that the language has as part of it. Later, it's hard to actually have the apparatus to be able to do that. And in many ways, this is like linguistics, but emotional linguistics. But you don't know what's missing because it just was omitted before you could register what it even was.
Well, the story that goes with this in my mind, which was a great teaching point, was I was working with a man who was suicidal, and he had had sex with his wife's best friend. His wife was divorcing him, and he was threatening suicide. And I did all this work with him, and it was ineffective. And I worked with a couple, and that was ineffective. So out of desperateness, I brought his parents in, and the mother then told me the story that, well, actually, I brought the whole family in. So the brother came into my office, and I said, I'm trying to figure out what's going on with your brother. Is there anything you could tell me that would be helpful? And he said, well, there was this time where he and I were in the shopping mall, and we turned a corner, and we saw my mother kissing another man. And it was kind of weird because my mom like goes to church every day, and it just seemed so out of character. So I said, that's interesting. So I was in group, and I said to the client, can you talk a little bit about what might be contributing to this? And he said, I had the world's greatest parents, and they love me and I love them, and I'm just screw up. And so I said, well, what about the time when you saw your mom kissing the other man in the shopping mall? And the guy, his eyes got really big, and he was like a black belt.
Yeah.
And he got up, and he went into one of these positions, like, I'm going to chop your head off. And he started coming towards me almost in slow motion, and he was going to kill me. And the entire group got it, and they got up, and they held this guy down for like about 10 minutes where he was completely out of control. So he sat back down, and I said, well, I guess we hit something important, being a very sophisticated therapist.
Oh, yes.
Right.
Oh,
Anyways, that it was so useful because I realized that sometimes when things don't make sense, you have to begin to excavate in some way. So I brought the mother and father in, and the mother started, I said, my son's suicidal, I've got to be able to say. And she said, when I was a child, I was incested by my father. And the husband looked and was completely in shock because he didn't know this. And she said, all my life, I've never been able to say this to anybody. And so as she began to talk about her trauma, we began to understand the origins of this guy's sexual acting out. But you would never put the two of them together. But honestly, having done this now for more than 50 years, it's almost always true that when you have somebody acting out in this way, there's something that happened in the previous generations where the origins of that get somehow transmitted in less than subtle ways.
Yeah. Well, I think family secrets are secrets because they have all this shame originally attached to them. Ironically, some about things that we don't consider all that shameful now, many of them, but they were a secret at the time, and they were fraught with shame, and they're deeply buried, but they're not so buried that they don't still somehow find their way into people's behavior.
Of course, if the parents don't work it out, then the children have to.
That's what I think happens, is that, all of us, despite everyone's best intentions, because some people have excellent intentions, but whatever's unfinished finds its way to reemerge so that it can be concluded in some way, so that it can be reconciled. The unreconciled, particularly, finds a way to reemerge in order to be reconciled. And so rather than thinking about that as someone's fault, I guess I would think of that as somewhat inevitable, and to just look at how and in what way understanding and healing can occur. But I think it's also useful to apologize. Ironically, what often happens here is that someone will be here working on their stuff, and then they'll say something like, oh my God, I realized that, yeah, despite my best intentions, I couldn't be there for my child in this way because, yeah, there was no way. And I just am sad about it. I regret it. And I went home and told my adult child, I called them and said, here's the thing. And everybody in the room's like, oh my God, I wish I'd ever heard anything like that. It would be so incredibly healing. I would just give anything for that. So I think it's ironic that we create a shame-based situation where acknowledging past mistakes or having regrets can cost a person rather than be accepted gracefully.
Okay, so we've talked about mentalizing, which is this ability to reflect on one's internal emotional experience and make sense of it, or reflect on the mind of others. And there's whole manuals on teaching people mentalizing, and it's become an evidence-based treatment, sort of like DBT. And it's really powerful stuff. And what Lori is saying is that we're seeing a lot of immigrants these days, and they come from cultures such as Iran and so on, and have lived through the revolution. And they don't recognize how much of their current symptomatology relates to the past because, they're so happy to be, in the land of the free and so on, that they don't realize that they're carrying with them their culture. And when it's called cultural-based psychotherapy, I think you really have to understand in a trauma-based approach, what the experience of the child was during these incredible experiences in other cultures and what they've had to endure. And it's very hard in America to be able to empathize with the horrors of what some of these individuals have experienced. So our model then, just to turn this around then, is an internal model. And what we're doing is we're encouraging a model of self-parenting, and it's more positive parenting. And having the person self begin to have a relationship with their exile or injured parts and begin to tell them now what they needed to hear back then, and begin to understand what is healthy parenting. I would say that Dan Brown invented an approach of working with what he called the ideal parent paradigm. And in it, it was so useful because so many people didn't realize what it meant to have an ideal parent or a secure attachment. And by beginning to learn the ideal parent, what they began to do is not only change the way they thought about their own parts of self that were injured, but then how to begin to treat their own children. And what you see is as a person becomes more loving to self, become more loving to their partner and to their children, the whole system begins to change.
About what you said a few minutes ago, I just wanted to add that we don't all live in the same America either.
That's true.
However, there are many different kinds of slavery that can occur, and the real problem is that the way of thinking associated with it becomes internalized. So then what you're saying is that being able to self-parent from an empathic place is both the way and the means and the ultimate goal. So I would say again, then the reason people are ineffective is because they lack empathy. And the reason they lack empathy is that they've sealed away their own life experience that would inform them because it's too damn painful. So can't blame a person for that. But for example, a recent client who was struggling with a couple of addictive behaviors and struggling with knowing what was necessary to do, but just not being able to do it and really faulting himself for it. And trying to do it by will. You can't think your way to health. and you can't only will your way there. You have to see what is in the way, what are the obstacles. When he was able to go back in a way, and you can do this many ways through many different modalities, including using psychodramatic or expressive therapy ways, but to be able to allow a person to, in a sense, revisit not what they think it was like, but what it really felt like to be the 8-year-old they were in a circumstance where they didn't feel like they had a father because he was there, but not there, and to live in poverty and to have to figure things out. So it's like outwardly, a person becomes a success, but inwardly, there's still a void that causes them to engage in addictive behaviors. But what I would say is that nothing would have changed things in as profound a way as his reconnecting with that 8-year-old part of self. Not what he thought it was like to be 8, but what it really felt like to be living in that reality. And when he was able to respond from what Dick Schwartz would call a self-led place, which is he felt compassion. And it's like, oh my God, now I remember. And now he also remembered why he wanted to avoid. And then his current behavior began to make sense as like a strategy to never be in the same situation again, but a strategy that was leading him to that exact outcome of winding up in the same situation again, which is, of course, the irony that our ways of making sure it never happens to us again lead us right into something that ensures that happens again.
Well, what you're saying is really interesting because it gets back to when the client comes in, most often they're thinking about feeling. And so they think they feel empathy. But in psychodrama or expressive therapies, they're actually able to genuinely feel what the child felt like, which is a whole different experience. And that's the difference in trauma work. I think in trauma therapy, everyone says they do trauma therapy this day, which where people are basically thinking about feeling. But trauma therapy means that you're able to feel what you're thinking.
Right. At the same time as, you're able to have access to all the wisdom that you've accumulated subsequently and all the frameworks that you understand now that you couldn't understand when you were 8. So you can think about it, but at the same time, you can feel what it felt like, and then bring to the situation what the 8-year-old needed at the time, but there was no one able to provide. Again, through no one's fault per se, but no one was able to provide it at the time. And that part of self still needs it. People are always like, well, yeah, that was a long time ago. I should just grow up. I shouldn't need it anymore. Okay, well, good luck with that. Because we all have these unhealed parts and we can choose to ignore them for a lifetime, and we could just not reproduce, and we could just, treat other people through our projections. And I guess that's what makes the world go round. Or you could heal.
So for the people who want to know more about the ideal parent, David Elliott runs workshops on this, and you can look at some of his work online. But it's really wonderful stuff. Right. So fortunately, there's something called earned secure attachment. And thank God for that, which means that even if you have childhood experiences that result in lots and lots of bad stuff, that you can begin to develop earned secure attachment. And the goal of psychotherapy is to facilitate earned secure attachment. Now, for the next 5 or 10 minutes, I'm going to talk about what we actually do in a cookbook way to be able to facilitate that. And it starts with a self-narrative, and where you can begin not only to talk about, but feel the events that have occurred in your life. And grieving, which is what all psychotherapy is about, the losses that have occurred. And to look at what have been done to you and what you've done to others as a result of what was done to you, and the beginning to form a balanced reliance on self and others. So a lot of work around codependency and the difference between codependency on one side and avoidance of closeness on the other side. I'm a big fan
Yeah.
of Masterson's original work. And in Masterson, he talks about the extension of the interpsychic conflict on the outer world. And this last sentence I love, which is, these problems are played out using another, not for his or her real self, but as an involuntary actor cast in a role from a scenario the patient repeats in the present in order to avoid past memories and feelings. God, that is such an intense statement. What he's saying is that if I haven't worked out my family of origin issues, I am going to project them into the relationship and try to use the partner in order to be able to find some completion of that. And so marital problems are not really about the two people. They're about a person taking the unfinished business of the past and projecting it onto the partner in some ways. And so what the idea of this is, instead of divorcing your partner, maybe you ought to divorce your parents. And it's a form of separation and individuation that needs to be able to be finished and facilitated.
Of course, maybe you've picked a partner who's really comparable, and maybe your parents changed for the better. So maybe, you just never know.
Well, the best way to heal is to find a partner who's securely attached. And if that happens, you don't need a therapist necessarily. That relationship will heal you.
Maybe, but don't take that in a codependent way, like you should go out and heal people who need it, because that won't work.
Now, one of the issues that so many of the clients have is, why do I keep picking partners that hurt me? And that's part of avoidant attachment, which is that I keep picking partners over and over again that are destructive. So let's talk a little bit about that. Okay. We fall in love with people who carry a disowned part of self and projected it. Can you explain that?
Okay. Yes, I can. Well, there's a couple things that can happen, but as Mark's saying, I'll just use the common example. So let's say I find someone who is very capable and unflappable and can handle all situations with, if not grace, then effectiveness. And I think, wow, that person is just amazing. I want to be like that when I grow up. Or maybe I don't quite think it that way, but you know what I'm saying? It's like, I think that's awesome. Maybe at the same time, that person thinks, wow, she can feel things. She's actually not shut down. She actually can cry and can laugh. And, at a funeral, she's sorrowful and she can grieve. Wow, that's cool, because I've been shut down and just handling things effectively for so long. I don't know how to do that. So these two people meet each other, and initially it's kind of joyous because it's almost like they complete each other. Colors are brighter. Lyrics make sense. Anyway, all that happens. Time goes on, and it can go one of two ways. Either, in truth, each can utilize the other person and their own growth in that area can be facilitated if it's okay with the relationship. But sadly, what often happens more of the time, I think, is that each person becomes further polarized. So she's like, oh my God, do you just have to be handling things all the time? Why the hell can't you feel anything? And he's like, well, because you feel everything. You're feeling for both of us. I'm going to work. And so each of them becomes more entrenched in what the other saw as positive about them. And now the very thing that drew them together is driving them apart.
So let's start summarizing. The goals in therapy are One, to label and express emotions deeply, which means that you have to get to know oneself. To relate and relax defensive boundaries, which Lori will talk a little bit about. To make sense of the minds of others, which we've called metacognition. Create a meaningful self-narrative that includes beginning to look at losses and feeling them deeply. Breathing. Developing ease with self-imperfections and beginning to work with their own internal self-narrative of sadomasochism. Developing a greater sense of self-compassion, understanding that each of us is a miracle and unique and extraordinary in our own right. To challenge our internal critique and not allow these internal voices to beat us up all the time and become spontaneous creatures more alive. Masterson has a book called In Search of the Real Self, which is a wonderful book about beginning to move from false self to real self, which is what we're talking about. And then I just gave you 2 questions here that I find really as a gift. These are from the adult attachment interview that Mary Main came up with, but they're so useful. And it just says, when you think about your childhood experiences, do you think they had an influence on you as an adult? And the second one, when you think about your parents' behavior towards you when you were a child, why do you think they behaved in the way they did? And the answers to these questions will tell you everything you need to know about avoidant attachment. For example, if the person says that, oh, my parents really influenced me and they've helped me become an accountant and make me interested in, numbers. Well, that's avoidant attachment. If you answer, when you think about your parents' behavior towards you when you were a child, why do you think they behaved in the way they did? If you say, I don't know, that's avoidant attachment. And so, the answers are always fascinating. And I just give you Lundy's reference here, Attachment and Defense Against Intimacy, Rutledge, 2013. And she's incredible. She's really good stuff. She's from Great Britain.
Okay, 2 quick things. So I think before, how some people say, well, before you have a we, you have to have an I. Yeah. Okay. I know people get tired of hearing that, but I also think that before, somewhere after you begin to have an I and before you have the definitive we that might be the we, it's good to have intimate relationships with other human beings who are not your intended romantic partner. And I just find that so many of the people that we treat are absolutely extraordinary human beings. And because they don't know it, and because it all gets kind of scary, they wind up spending their time with a substance or behavior, workaholism, starvation, binging, etc. And so I'm really kind of pro human relationship and intimacy therein. Then I like to tell you some books that I find useful while Mark's already reading the questions. And you can see if you find any of them interesting or useful. In terms of self-hate, I think the book Compassion and Self-Hate by Theodore Isaac Rubin is a good book. It's not something I recommend for clients but there are pieces of it, like he talks about how we can hate ourselves for hating ourselves, and it just deepens. So, and why it's hard to rectify, but he really breaks down a lot of things. I think that for self-hatred in the ways that it gets internalized and actually changing it, there's a book by Sherry Huber called There's Nothing Wrong with You, No Matter What You've Been Taught. That's really great. For grief, there's a book by Frances Weller, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, which is also a wonderful book. I still like Dance of Anger from Harriet Lerner. That's an old one, but a good one. And it talks about anger and women's anger particularly, and talks about triangulation, talks about overfunctioning, underfunctioning, and it's very useful.
Okay, so as we begin to look at some of the questions, I just want to say that um, that uh, a lot of the work we do is really targeted around boundaries and internal relationships and depth work. We're lucky enough to have a length of stay of 2 to 3 months. Usually people are seen 3 times a week, so they're really getting able to do depth work. But I would say that the most recent thing that we're realizing is that we have maybe 50% of our clients are bipolar, and getting on the right medication, getting the right diagnosis, understand the continuity of bipolar and how it's a spectrum disorder, and they tend to be more different than they are similar. And it takes 7 years to diagnose someone with bipolar. And I think most of the people that come in have not been on optimal medication. So, I really emphasize the importance of diagnosis and beginning to get proper medication, because these new medications allow us to do much better psychotherapy. If a person is actively manic or actively depressed under bipolar, your psychotherapy is going to be limited in some ways. What I would say, one of the questions about sensate focus, since we've been trained by Master St. Johnson, we think that mindfulness exercises and sensate focus related is absolutely essential, but it's one of the last things we do, because what we're looking for is internal work with self in order to be able to begin to have birth to the ability to use others as a resource. And being able to do sensate focus is a real important piece of that. So helping them find eventually partners, and then partners that they can be physically close with, and begin to use sensate focus as a tool. There's a lot of incredible changes in the brain that occur as a result of that.
So how do you, if you've got a couple that's entrenched and polarized, how do you get them out? I mean, there are a lot of different kinds of marital therapy, all of which can be useful. I mean, there's not one way of doing marital therapy that works. It's more about the therapist. I like doing marital therapy in a co-therapy format with two therapists, because they're two clients, and it just allows for more attention to the relationship as well as each person, and the degree of work that you can do in a kind of short-term intensive format using two co-therapists is typically very powerful. But there are also some things to read that are kind of interesting. I mean, one thing that deals with polarized parts is internal family systems therapy. And of course, they have a website and they have lists of therapists that practice that modality and who are trained. And it's possible for people who are not therapists to also become well versed. And there's a primer one can send for from the website. I also find Harville Hendricks and Helen Hunt imago therapy can be very powerful for people, and their premises are really, I think, absolutely on target. And Receiving Love is one of the books that they've written that I also highly recommend as well.
Well, thank you all for being part of this. We really appreciate it. And if you ever want to come to heaven, come visit us in Monterey. You're always welcome here. And we sometimes invite therapists to sit in on groups, and I think you'd find that really valuable and interesting. And if you'd like to be able to ask questions, feel free to email us or call us, and we're readily available.
Especially Mark.
Thank you all.
Thank
Goodbye.
you very much.